Today's new 3.2 million unemployment claims brings the current total to 33.5 million new jobless claims in 7 weeks. Of course, that is due to the COVID lockdown, and there are some issues related to that. Is unemployment really as deadly as coronavirus? And this article references The Big Short, which is a 2015 film, in which there is the statement made that 40,000 people die in the United States for every 1% increase in unemployment. Now, in this case, of course, we do have the president's programs, and we probably won't see those type of numbers. In Australia, currently, suicide rise from lockdowns to kill more than coronavirus. So this lockdown is having a tremendous impact on many, many people. And the stated number were that 2.2 million Americans were going to die due to COVID. However, the number is proving to be far short of that. And I have a Daily Mail article, Elon Musk leads U.S. anger at hypocritical British professor lockdown Neil Ferguson over his rule-breaking trysts after issuing report that predicted 2 million deaths in America. So we have this frame of reference where, due to fear of a virus, people are being forced to stay at home and not work. And we were told that there might be 2 million deaths due to COVID. There haven't been anywhere near that, but there are so many people at home filing for unemployment, becoming frustrated, and there are many ripples of this lockdown that may indeed end up killing many, many people, and certainly more, even in Australia currently, deaths due to the lockdown than due to COVID. So, Ken, I think it's possible that some of this could have been prevented had some information been released that could have saved us all a lot of trouble.
Attention has focused on Dr. Fauci, and he was unknown to almost everyone. The name was vaguely familiar, but so was Donald Trump as a politician 5 years ago. So we've adjusted, and I think most of us drew his attention, or he drew our attention when he came out very quickly against chloroquine. The president was supportive of at least exploring that, and this really raised my suspicions, and I think everyone else too, that he would come out so negatively during a state of emergency, which to me was just illogical. It didn't make sense as a strategy that you wouldn't. It's sort of like, okay, your house is on fire, but your inspection tag is out of date, and you can't use this fire extinguisher on that fire. And completely inappropriate logical sequence for somebody who is supposedly helping to attenuate a dangerous situation. And the concern I have with it is most of the time it's used as a preventative medication. It's very commonly known for people that have been stationed in South America. I think how I came in contact with that was through Jack Spirko, who I'm very familiar with in the resilience movement. And he did a very insightful video on how he had been petitioning the White House for chloroquine, and relating the fact that he had used the malarial preparation as a prophylactic. And that's the context where it's used. So if we look at our supply chain as being dependent upon essentially, meat packing and jobs like that, why wouldn't that have been accelerated, that process of maybe protecting that's part of the supply chain? Because I guess there was an outbreak in the meat packing industry. How it was handled after that, we'll not know at this point, but I think there were some fatalities associated with that, and maybe that was in the handling at the hospital later. We don't know, but these workers are not protected, and I think that's having an effect as well as the lack of an effective, very quick review of this as a prophylactic. But Don, what are your thoughts on this as we kick off the show?
Well, yeah, what I've noticed this week is that it has come out that chloroquine was actually mentioned in context with the earlier SARS, early 2000s, whenever that came out. There was news that was never quite reached, of course, any kind of near the level that we've got now coming out about COVID-19, which is just a total barrage. But there are mentions of hydroxychloroquine in the press from the SARS epidemic, and of course that coronavirus that we have now is very similar to SARS. Some call it SARS-2. So it's not like we haven't been here before. In fact, the fact that Fauci would be so resistant to bringing this up isn't at all because it's an unknown. It's actually a known. And when you learn that there are very few profits to be made and very the effectiveness per dose is so much greater with the hydroxychloroquine when you catch it early enough that it could have been a great preventative. And President Trump got the word out early, but he was shut down, or tried to be shut down, by those that really actually not only should have known better, but it can be proven that they did know better. So we're getting into the territory where these people are doing exactly the wrong thing, and you have to begin to wonder what is going on. Why are they giving not exactly bad advice, but they're steering things in exactly the wrong direction? It's become highly suspicious.
There's one extremely bizarre aspect to this story, and just to give us a little bit of breathing room, because it's kind of comic relief, there is a television show called The Dead Zone. Now it's based on a Stephen King novel, and the original film I think is pretty great. It was Christopher Walken. But the TV show, there was an episode in 2003 called Plague. And in this episode, some children in a school became ill right before a science fair. They had a lockdown. They were told to wear masks. The virus that was causing the sickness was a SARS-related coronavirus. And if anybody who knows the story of the Dead Zone, it's about a psychic. It's about a guy who was in a terrible car crash and was in a coma for something like 6 years. And then when he woke up, he was psychic. So the psychic in this episode, in this plague episode of Dead Zone, hears the word chloroquine in his head. And because everyone knows he's a psychic and his information has often been reliable, the doctors try chloroquine on this terrible coronavirus plague, and it works. Shock and awe. So
what you're saying is President Trump has been watching too much old sitcoms, too much old TV, right?
I'm not saying anything. People have to draw their own conclusions. All I'm saying is there's a lot of weird stuff surrounding everything having to do with this virus.
I got to point out my weird stuff that I came across this week. Fauci's name in Italian means the jaws of a carnivore or the jaws of a wolf. Well, I wonder if he's wearing sheep's clothing. Maybe it's not, working so well anymore. I think people are seeing through him.
There's so many aspects to this. It's hard to keep track of them. Then we've got the whole Wuhan lab tie in. And this is one of the problems I've had with the Fauci, WHO, Tedros, is they knew they were playing with fire. They really did. If going back many, many years, these were deadly pathogens that had a dual use as, in the medical community, but also as just as bioweapons. I mean, it's pretty much been admitted. And I'm not saying that they did this on purpose, but what I'm saying is that they definitely covered up the impact in the early stages, because everybody knows there's a lot of film or video footage of Dr. Fauci downplaying the risk, and I think Tedros was doing the same thing. And that's not cool, because they were dealing with they were playing with fire essentially. But the other thing might as well jump in, Cindy, if you're ready for the New York City COVID study. Is it time for that?
Sure. Yeah, this is a great time.
Yeah, we're kind of moving all over the horizon here, but there is a lot. There are many aspects to this, and we're not saying that there isn't a COVID-19 threat. It's very real, but I think some of the ways it's being handled are either, on the one end, bizarre or ignorant. On the other hand, they're just downright homicidal, genocidal, and that may sound like hyperbole, but let's take a look at this story. Now, background is there's a show called X22 that's familiar to many people that in alternative media, and it's a very good summary. I think it's applicable. Anybody could watch it and have at least one or two insights from it, probably more. It's just a well-rounded news feed is a good idea these days, that's for sure. But he mentioned a study of coming out of the New York City Department of Health, and it was a staggering number. And I remember thinking, wait a minute, I need to look at this again. So basically, the bottom line, well, Cindy will probably have the display up on the finished video. But if you look at, I spliced that little diagram, and the original hyperlink is in the tweet that we did, and I'll keep retweeting it on our channel on Twitter, Poli-Psych podcast team on Twitter. And the total death there is about 13,500. And then they list out it's a two-dimensional array. So you get it's an interesting graph. The full version of the graph details location, which borough, and also by gender, and they all end up with the same total. So it really is just a different way of parsing the data. The one I like is the age group parsing, which appears here, and you'll see that there's a lot of takeaways. Most of the fatalities were in the higher age bracket, especially the 75 and over, which I would characterize as elderly, especially considering physical condition. But here's the staggering part, jumping right to it, is the no underlying conditions column appears. It's the one that's towards the middle, right in the center of the graphic. And so out of the 13,500, only 83 are listed as having no underlying conditions. Underlying conditions are footnoted as diabetes, lung disease, cancer, immunodeficiency, heart disease, hypertension, asthma, kidney disease, GI liver disease, and obesity. Now, I guess you could say the last one is sort of ubiquitous in the culture, but I think they were probably talking about something closer to morbid obesity, where where it's on par with these other serious conditions. But 83 out of 13,500. And it's just a staggering number. Now, what bothers me about this the most is underlying conditions unknown. Where did those people end up in the hospital? Were they sequestered or segmented or banished to a corner of the hospital and exposed to additional risk factors that then contributed to their demise? Same with the underlying conditions. A staggering 10,262 who must have been treated differently than the general hospital population if they were classified as a COVID case. So effectively, they were running it's just either malicious homicide or genocide. I mean, I just put it out there until they can a burden of proof rests on the people that had custody over these patients, and how they ended up with a fatality level after treating them like they had, the plague. With intubation coming from room to room. Donald point this out. I think he uncovered some things. And what did you find, Don, about the in-hospital conditions?
Well, one of the stories that I came across this week was a video of a nurse who has a nurse friend that was involved in New York City care. And basically what she described is, horrifying is a strong word, but the person does use that word. It's basically a level of neglect that you would not expect in American hospitals. And it's basically brought about by the fear that the nursing staff has of the virus itself and the conditions surrounding it. So you have a high degree of neglect of patients that are in wards that are associated with having some coronavirus patients in them. Things like the nurses not actually entering into care for the patients and to try to avoid contact with them, and the tubing running out of the rooms instead of in the normal way that you would have it right there to be controlled at the level of the patient. A lot of things that just say that the nursing staff in some of these places is very fearful, and that fear is causing them to make bad decisions. I can't help but wonder if the propaganda banners and posters that we see about heroes' work here might actually be a cover-up, because there is so much fear in these places. It's almost the opposite of what that propaganda poster would portray.
So we have these death numbers that are pointed to in New York City, and we see that it's likely that a much smaller number of deaths is actually due to COVID directly. And there's also this anecdotal evidence from James O'Keefe, Michael Lanza, funeral director, Colonial Funeral Home, who stated that COVID has been on virtually all of the death certificates, and whether they had a positive test or whether they didn't. So we have that testimony from a funeral director. And we also, in the video Plandemic, the movie, part 1, it's primarily an interview with Judy Mikovits, but there are also comments, on-screen comments from several doctors who are saying that the official story that's being disseminated through the legacy media is not what they are experiencing as physicians. And also Dr. Jerome Corsi has been interviewing quite a few physicians who are telling a different story. And there've been a couple of doctors who recently died of murder suicides from some large hospitals where there have been purported to be a lot of COVID deaths. So there, again, as both of you have said, there are just so many weird aspects. It's difficult for us to decide what to talk about, because this story is, every single thread we follow leads us to another layer of corruption. So it's difficult to even discuss it because of just how much corruption there is on every layer.
Yeah, that's actually the point that I'm at, is that this has become overwhelming. And I said before, maybe it was a couple of weeks ago, we had a show that I was very sure that President Trump had Fauci and Birx on display in order to help the American people see what was really going on. And I think we really have gotten to that level, at least to those of us that are paying close enough attention. We're almost overwhelmed at this point. One of the things that I do want to not forget to mention is that it's one of the tactics that these healthcare practitioners that operate at a macro level, the sociologically oriented medical doctors like Fauci, who don't spend much time with individual patients but deal with the big picture. They rely a lot on computer models, and the computer models have been basically blown to shreds in this last couple of weeks. So that's another tactic that they used to increase the fear early on, was to get people focused on these models that were predicting huge amounts of deaths. And they have been proven to be completely unreliable. And if it weren't for the fact that they'd relied on the models quite early, before there was even the mention of social distancing, you might think, well, the social distancing got us out of this. But no, it didn't. The models were actually proven incorrect, inaccurate, before the effects of social distancing could have even taken effect. So just wanted to point that out there. On multiple fronts, this whole narrative is collapsing. Unfortunately, the economic effects of it are what Cindy's mentioned at the beginning of the show. That's what we're really starting to deal with now, and that's, I think, why Americans really know they need to get back to work. The fear has broken, and most Americans are ready to, let's face this thing in whatever way we have to. We're confident that our medical system can deal with it, and it's not as bad as we thought, so let's get back to work.
We had really, originally, we've been talking about the show for a couple of weeks, and originally we were going to have the focus of the show as Dr. Fauci, because there's, there's plenty there to talk about. But so many of these other things have come up that we want to consider the big picture as much as possible. But one thing that is, I think, needs to be stated about Dr. Fauci is that he was being investigated. FBI investigation targeted Dr. Fauci, but Comey pulled the plug. And this is a true Pundit article. And if we go back into history a little bit to the AIDS epidemic, this is kind of where Dr. Fauci got his start. And we won't go through all of it, but just suffice it to say that, and we'll have links in our notes, but many AIDS victims were quite angry with Dr. Fauci because of how he handled the HIV/AIDS epidemic. And Judy Mikovits also was working on the AIDS issue many years ago. And a lot of the videos that she talks about, she brings up the AIDS issue. What happened at that time, and it's relevant to this because what we're seeing is kind of an echo. At that time, there were drugs proposed that seemed like they might be promising in addressing HIV/AIDS, but they were suppressed. And AZT, a drug that Dr. Fauci had a vested interest in, was heavily promoted. And the way AZT was being administered at first actually caused the deaths of possibly millions. Larry Kramer was a gay activist at that time. He claimed that Dr. Fauci was responsible for 17 million deaths of AIDS patients through the AZT scandal. So again, I wanted to bring that up to frame Dr. Fauci, his character, and what he might be likely to do in that way. So we see that echo of, now we have coronavirus, COVID-19, Wuhan virus, as it's called by some. And we have this very promising, if not proven, cure virtually in hydrochloroquine. And Dr. Fauci is moving to suppress the use of hydroxychloroquine so that remdesivir can be promoted, and he has a vested interest in remdesivir. So just for historical context, and I don't understand why someone who had so abused the system and people died. I don't know why he was permitted to remain in that position so that he would be here for yet another go round.
It's interesting how we see a progression. Anyone who worked in this field as either just paying attention to it as an interested party or working in support and in broadcasting, which we've all three of us have done as volunteers. But we see this succession of incidents, starting with the Seth Rich case, and then we had the early phase of the Russiagate, the later phase of the Mueller investigation, then moving forward into the impeachment phase, which was anchored off Ukraine. Now, when Ukraine came up, this is the situation started to reverse a little bit. So every issue they started to bring up had blowback, because I believe most of the people that were covering this in alternative media were very used to this cycle: rinse, repeat, wash, rinse, repeat. And so Ukraine ends up basically, just blowing apart. They introduced Ukraine, and then it had more effect on the Bidens, I think, than it did on President Trump in the end. And the impeachment hoax went away. And then all of a sudden we have this. So the point is that this issue, the pandemic, I guess we still have to call it a pandemic at this point. But pretty soon the effect is going to be worse than the cause. But what it's exposed these people. I didn't know who Dr. Fauci was, and now we can go back. Many people can go back to 2005 and see, just like Cindy had just said, we know his history, we know his character now, we know the wolf. And Tedros of WHO seems to be the analogous bureaucratic overlord, quasi-doctor, but I don't think Tedros is I think he's an epidemiological scholar rather than a doctor. So anyway, getting to the point is, I hope that the system itself gives doctors back their right to treat patients using the Hippocratic Oath, directly interfacing with their patients without all this interference from the insurance industry, which is almost a secondary thing in this case. But it's mostly in this situation, we're seeing exposed big pharma, the hospital groups, and these bureaucrats that we're studying today. Mostly we're focusing on Dr. Fauci, but he represents a system that, we're shedding light on the system at this point. But the problem I've always had with the hydroxychloroquine is that if a medical doctor is willing to put their reputation on the line and try this treatment during a state of emergency, they should be unrestrained from doing so. And anyone who impedes that process should, and hopefully will be, the target of a wrongful death lawsuit at some point in the future, if hydroxychloroquine does eventually pass through and prove to have been of use in that scenario, where they actually are it's causing the death of Americans, it's causing the collapse of our economy. I mean, literally, look around. And this is an attack from the invisible enemy. I think President Trump's metaphor doesn't refer to the virus. Let's just leave it at that. And we haven't quite defined it, but we're starting to.
Yeah, one of the things that I was thinking about as you were talking and Cindy was talking, Ken, is, and you pretty much directly stated it, what we're having here is an attack on the individual patient-doctor relationships at the grassroots level. That's pretty fundamental to a truly free society, to a culture of liberty. And that's been under attack. That's been under attack because of this top-down model that has been used to, in the name of safety for all, what's happened is we've all been put at risk. So what we have to ask, I think, at this stage is, how did this mechanism to do this get into place? I think part of the answer is that a lot of it has been color of law. We have people that are getting arrested because they're trying to go back to work, and they're finding out that there aren't actually any laws that they can be charged with breaking. So a lot of it is fraud and color of law, but there's a whole nother aspect of it, and that is that corruption has been incentivized, and at the bureaucratic level, there have been rewards in place for doing things that ended up being counterproductive. So that if you've got a new drug on the market and it is promising in the supposedly for a pandemic situation, that drug gets to go to the front of the line. Things like that, where supposedly a pathway has been cleared to help improve the lives of people, but at what expense? At the expense of actually things that have been proven in the past. So you have people posturing as if they're saviors when actually they're the ones that are undercutting the safety and the public trust. So it's really a perfect storm of liberty versus tyranny. We can see this medical tyranny it's not exactly in incipient form, but thank God it's not far enough along that they've got a complete lock on us. One of the things I was thinking about pointing out earlier, and I will now, is that this plandemic or this epidemic has long been something that has been envisioned and talked about by people in the liberty communities that have been warning about tyrannical takeovers as a way to do that. Well, now we see it in action. Now we see the form that it's taking. It's no longer something that we have thought about, this great epidemic that would really ravage mankind. It's actually here, and you know what? It's not nearly as scary as many people had predicted. I'm thinking about people like Steve Quayle that have long been warning about virus outbreaks, and there have been other people that have warned us that the bad guys had something like this coming. It really is almost a toothless tiger compared to what some people had expected. So all in all, I think that's a good thing. Doesn't mean there aren't some serious damages, mostly economically, but I think in a way we kind of have to breathe a sigh of relief and say, is that all you got?
Well, I think it'll hopefully lead to a new classification of work in this area, and what I mean by that are the biological microbes and the study that was going on in Wuhan, across China. Actually, it wasn't just Wuhan; they were building labs all across China with the help of the NIH and our tax dollars. So if we don't permit this gray area with nuclear weaponry, that's militarized completely. Yet we have this sort of open revolving door with these quasi globalist entities that have no allegiance to any government at all, or legal system. Really, they cross borders. That's one of the benefits I think they find with the globalist mindset, is that they can transcend judicial systems in sovereign countries and basically create their own hell on earth, really. I mean, in this case, unleashing a self-created weaponized virus on a civilian population, disabling the greatest economy in the world. And at that point, I think it's crossed the line. I don't think the perception is there yet in people that these are Nuremberg level crimes that were committed, either by malfeasance, possibly intentionally, but we just don't know. And it's just kind of ironic that we have this oscillating pattern. Personally, my life hasn't changed much over the last. It's just one thing after another, and it's so obvious. I'm sure there's some people that think this came out of left field, and we didn't know this would happen either. But I'm not surprised. Are you surprised, Don? Are you surprised, Cindy?
I'm not, but what will be a very pleasant surprise is one of the things that President Trump has been saying about the whole aspect of this attack by the deep state, and I think we do all agree that this is another wing of that attack, is that this can't be allowed to happen again. And so to me, that doesn't mean well, we set up some more laws and we set up some more bureaucracies and we set up some more monitoring systems. I think really what it has to mean at a fundamental level is there do have to be people that are punished, and severely punished for having committed these crimes. And what that means is, and I really do have this, I think it's more than a hope at this point. I'm pretty strongly convinced that the reason that we saw Fauci and BRICS for so long, and many other things that have played out, and the American people now can see through it, such as Comey, such as many of those Spygate plotters, is that we know that crimes were committed. So we're ready as a population to have some justice brought to in the actual courts of law with actual evidence, and that will be a deterrent that will prevent people from ever doing these types of things again.
When you say Nuremberg level, people might think that is an exaggeration, but we'll just watch these numbers. Already, again, in Australia, the number of suicides is surpassing the number of COVID deaths. And going back to see what Dr. Fauci did in the AIDS days, I will grant you, bitter victims claim that he killed millions of people. But it's worth looking at. I don't think that a statement like that can be made without doing some research. And once again, Dr. Fauci was being investigated, but Comey shut the investigation down. So as all these things just are, all these issues are swirling around everybody stuck at home with lots of time to read and study and do research, I pray to God that Americans will realize what's been happening and make moves with the government, become more active, more aware, and that this kind of thing will be prevented in the future. And I do just want to bring in one little aspect, which is the economic aspect. And Judy Mikovits talks about this a little bit in the Plandemic video. There was a bill that was passed called the Bayh Act, which permits, usually if you work for a company and you invent something, the company that you're working for holds the patent because that's just, it was their time. The Bayh Act made it so that patents could be held by people who were actually doing research with public monies. So what that means is public monies were used to come up with things that had potential to make profit, in some instances, great profit. And the patents for those products could be privately held. So this is huge, and Judy Mikovits believes that, okay, Bill Gates says we're not going to go back to work until there's a vaccine, and I guess the state of Washington I heard they're following through that. But what Judy Mikovits says is that there needs to be a reversal of the Bayh Act before we can once again have dependable research from academic institutions. So moving forward, hope we get that.
I agree, because what you're doing with that is really a classic case of socializing the loss and privatizing the profit. It hardly gets more clear-cut than that, and that's exactly the type of corruption that I was talking about earlier. It's that we need to identify and root out of the system. I think sometimes when people are in a naive sort of a mindset, we don't see how these things that may sound justified in one case can be completely subverted and completely turned against the public interest as this has. So it's time for people, I think, to stop being naive and to be able to recognize corruption and to take our blinders off.
It appears that the target of this, if we do assume that it may be the reaction itself, we separate that from the virus itself, but the reaction itself appears to be to collapse the economy, and it appears to be directed at the reelection of President Trump. And we can see in the blue states the dogged pursuit of that goal. And we don't see that in the red states. And that will hopefully be unmasked shortly. And unless we've crossed the Rubicon and have ruined the economy beyond hope, and that is possible. At some point, we do have an irrevocable damage done, and that was detailed in an article I'll be tweeting, assessing this point of view from the perspective of Britain, England, and covering. It's an interesting article, and it'll be called. Let's see, it's kind of a rough title here: "The Castration of a Nation," and it looks at the unintended consequences of the layoff and how that does tend to squelch demand for goods and just the general mindset of economy that is based on retail consumption. We can see that destroyed pretty much. But the last thing I'll say, just to kind of wrap up my contribution, is the bigger picture of the health system itself. And we all have had broken bones, most of us, or an injury where, we've got to go to a place called the hospital and get, have the leg, set or splinted, and then you have crutches. You need that. You need that infrastructure. But it seems to me that just from, I was born in 1957, peak of the baby boom, that the vax culture came into being during this time and grew and grew and grew to the point where we have the hospital group consolidation, and it takes forever to get a physical. I mean, it's completely changed. The whole system is completely changed. But it's almost like we've evolved there's a natural health system that does tend to blend in with the general population's hospital system, again, for the injuries that we can see. But there's this new form of self-created injury that, we can't see it. We have to just trust, the cholesterol level is too high, or we need to get this vaccination, that vaccine, the vax programming has come into being. Not always. We don't know. I mean, some of it's probably beneficial, but it looks like in general, the flu shots and all, there's enough anecdotal evidence that these things are harmful, and this coronavirus firmly falls into that culture. It was a self-created virus, and it's a result of, again, man tinkering with the forces of nature and acting like, assuming the powers of a god. That's what Fauci and Tedros are. They're human gods. They preside over our health, and they purport to have our best interest at heart, when we're seeing increasingly evidence that that's not the case. And going back to the Christian gospel, the Jesus ministry was based on healing. And whether we take the Bible literally or not, there's still that fact remains that there was a natural healing process that was an integral part of the gospel and an integral part of the spiritual being as we accept it as Christians. And then you look at the other side, this evil side, that we see people wearing masks and looking like phantoms walking down the street it's just a horrific image. And I live in New York State, so this is a constant sight everywhere. And it's a pretty stark reminder that there's something else going on here. And it's the timeless battle between the natural or God-inspired method of healing versus this other dark healing that is the opposite of healing. It's a lie. It's a fraud. And personal feeling after seeing this and living with these stories for the last 2 months is that Dr. Fauci is a fraud, and he needs to be removed from power. I don't know about the legal process involved, but he definitely should not be a spokesman. Bill Gates, again, has also sacrificed most of his integrity in my own mind and in the minds of millions of other people. And these people need to go. And the microbiological research has to be militarized. It no longer in the power of these trans-judicial nations, the globalist WHO, who makes up its own laws as it goes along and jumps from country to country. It's got to go, and I think that's hopefully the last straw. This is the last straw. I don't see this recurring because I hope that President Trump does take control, takes the reins of power away from these people, and brings it back into the sovereign nation or a community of sovereign nations. No longer the globalists. Wipe out the WHO and completely rearrange these departments, the NIH, the NAID, the CDC. I mean, it needs to be segmented into a different structure that has a unity of command rather than this sort of separate, overlapping, hard to understand structure. I still don't understand how these four agencies interact with each other, but they're all involved, and they've all been involved with China for years and years and years. And here's the result.
Yeah, Ken, I really think a lot of that overlapping bureaucracy has to do with the idea of plausible deniability. They can point the finger at the other guy, who's actually their partner in crime, and can both together or multiple together undermine the actual integrity of the individual at the national level. And America really has always been at its core a people that honored individual liberty, the right to personally decide what's best for your life, for your body, and we're at a testing point in that. And today is the National Day of Prayer, the first Thursday of the month of May. And I like to read a couple of tweets. I always really like Charlie Daniels' prayers every morning on Twitter. He tweets out something. This is today's. The president has declared today a National Day of Prayer. Would you believers join me in pausing at some time during the day and saying a prayer for our nation, our leaders, the defeat of coronavirus, and that God will send revival to our country and renewal to his church. Amen. And this is from Greg Laurie, evangelist out in Riverside, California. This is the first National Day of Prayer that we have had during a global pandemic. God has told us exactly what to do during a time like this. We need to pray. 2 Chronicles 7:14 was given us as a promise to Israel, but in principle it applies to any nation. Let's all pray today. And I would add that in context, that was actually in a time where there was a disease like a pandemic. And there was great national suffering. And I happened to come across this really interesting thread that ties some spiritual information together about this economic situation that we're all in. And it has to do with the parable of the rich man and Lazarus that Jesus told about how the Lazarus experienced hard things in this life, but then he was with Abraham's bosom, and the rich man was tormented in hell and wanted to go to be with Lazarus, but just wanted a drop of water to cure his torment, and he wasn't able. And in this parable that Jesus told, which of course is a spiritual truth, it has to do with the rich really persecuting the poor. And interestingly enough, there is a video in which a pastor ties the word for the rich man that's used in that text to the town of Davos, Switzerland, where the World Economic Forum is held. And he makes the case that these people know what they're doing. They're thumbing their nose at God. Now, this is not to say that all rich people are like this, that all rich people do this, but the world's 6 largest corporations, I believe it's 6, all attend regularly this Davos forum, and they basically run the world economic system and make agreements among themselves. And this is the rich man tormenting the poor man. And that's the system that we've actually been under. And in this thread, the question is COVID-19 a test run to see if we'll accept the New World Order? Well, it sure looks like that to me. All the things that we've been saying on this show sure look like that. And again, what they're even doing with this economic situation is trying to make it look like we're the greedy people if we want to restore a vibrant economy because we're greedy, while they posture moral superiority from their lavishly furnished bunkers that are immune to any of the economic turbulence. So don't buy it, people. This is a ploy to get you to buy into them, these overlords of humanity, actually bringing their subjugation into its final form. I believe humanity is rising up, that won't happen, and that's our call today to prayer on this National Day of Prayer as Poli-Psych team, is to ask you to join with us to pray for human free will exercised in harmony with the will of God to be able to take hold of a beautiful and vibrant future together. And it's within our grasp. Just don't fall for the lies. Thank you.
To the curious, the seekers, and the experts, thank you for joining us for this episode of Poli-Psych Podcast. We hope that you have enjoyed this episode. If you have, we would ask that you please click like, share, subscribe to us on YouTube, subscribe to us on BitChute. Certainly follow us on Twitter. I think you'll enjoy that. If you have a moment, please visit our website. Again, thank you for joining us. And until next time, take care.